Okay, hi everyone. So as Nick said, my name's Lara and I'm a PhD student here at the University of Huddersfield, and I'm also an associate member of the Ni3 Research Centre. So I'll just talk very briefly about my experience of studying for a PhD in gender-based violence. So I'll discuss what my kind of research area is and just a few of the challenges that I've faced in conducting research in this area. So throughout my research project, I've really been exploring experiences of rape trials in England. So I've conducted 4 interview studies with different groups, really just to get different perspectives of trials. So first I interviewed 2 professional groups. So this included independent sexual violence advisors, or ISVAs, who support survivors throughout court cases and the run-up to cases, as well as barristers who both prosecuted and defended on rape and serious sexual offences cases in England. So after this, I then also interviewed individuals who had served as jurors on rape trials, as well as victim or survivors themselves, who had their cases had gone through the criminal justice system and ended in a trial. So these interviews really concerned individuals' experiences in terms of their views with regards to what was routinely done well throughout trials and any issues that they experienced and how they thought these issues could be addressed. And there was a particular focus on participants' views around jurors in rape trials, whether jurors were the most appropriate for these trials and whether they should be provided information around rape cases to kind of dispel rape myths. So as we've sort of identified earlier in the session, one of the big challenges in conducting research in this area is really just managing your own well-being given the sensitive nature of these topics. So I'll just discuss briefly some of the things that I did, some very sort of basic things that I did to try and manage my well-being and address this throughout my PhD. So the first thing that I think is really important that we've kind of touched on earlier is just to take breaks when you need to. And feeling that you can take that break and that it will be a benefit to do so. So this was particularly important when transcribing interviews, for example. So this can obviously be quite a time-consuming task, and I think there's the temptation to just sort of sit and get it all done. But I think it was really important for me to recognise where I might have benefited from taking a break, taking a step back from the interviews and just having that space to sort of stop for a short period. And also related to this, I often found that I wanted to kind of transcribe my interviews or start to transcribe my interviews on the day that I'd done them. But again, sort of recognising when it might be beneficial not to do that and to take a step back was really important. And in line with this, another good piece of advice that I had at the beginning of my PhD was to only conduct 1 interview a day. So as we've identified, you know, it can have quite an impact on you to hear people's experiences. And that should be recognised, and so that you know you manage your time only having the 1 interview a day, so you're not perhaps sort of overloaded with this information and feel overwhelmed by it. So that was a really important piece of advice. And actually there was only one day where I did do 2 interviews, and that was with 2 survivors, and I did feel the impact on that and the knock-on effect over the next few days where that did sort of impact how I felt and how I was able to really engage with my work throughout that time. And another thing that I wish to sort of just note about that is the fact that that day was actually during our first lockdown in England. So it was interesting that somebody mentioned earlier the kind of impact about not only conducting sensitive research, but doing this, working from home and bringing that kind of research into your home environment, and therefore not having that social support that you might have and being perhaps isolated through lockdowns, and the kind of coupled impact of those 2 things. So I think that would be something really interesting to explore in the future in terms of the impact that working in a more isolated way and from home might have had on us throughout this time and doing this research. So as I mentioned, it's really important to have that good social support and support from supervisors. So I was really lucky throughout my PhD to have both of those. So I had close links with other researchers in the department, other PhD researchers conducting similar research, who really had that awareness of how it could impact you as well. But also to have really excellent supervisors who are always there to be able to discuss difficult interviews with. So I think these things are just important to raise and to be aware of, and I think you know, it's important to recognise that these things should be in place for every PhD researcher or researchers further along in their career, and that these things really should be in place. So another challenge that I faced throughout my PhD was accessing participants or certain participant groups. So to recruit ISVAs and barristers, that was quite straightforward, as I was able to contact their workplaces, contact people directly, and anybody who was interested was able to just get back in touch with me quite easily. Whereas with jurors, there wasn't the same kind of list of people, if you like, to contact. I was relying on putting up posters in sort of hallways on campus or online, and just sort of hoping that that would reach people that had sat on rape trials in England. So that was slightly more difficult. Another issue in terms of conducting any research with jurors in the UK is that you're unable by law to discuss deliberations. So there's restrictions on what you can research with jurors. And I think this feeds into the fact that there is a very limited amount of research with jurors in England. I think this is partly because of reluctance on the part of researchers who may be unaware or may have misconceptions around what you are able to research in this area, but it also may have an effect on participants in terms of their perhaps reluctance to want to take part or to come forward. So the way that I managed this was to just be really clear throughout my recruitment that they were able to take part, and just be really clear what the restrictions were, what they could discuss and what they couldn't. So that was really clear on the posters where I'd advertised study, and I also reiterated this throughout. So when people contacted me, I then sent them the interview questions, which again reiterated what they could and couldn't discuss, and the fact that the questions were in relation to the courtroom experience rather than the deliberations. So another challenge was trying to get approval to recruit judges to interview. So earlier on in my project, I did plan to also speak to judges as well as the other interview groups that I had. So unlike barristers, you're unable to just contact judges directly. What I had to do was go through quite a lengthy process of an online application, that then went through to the senior presiding judge in England for approval. So as I say, it was quite a lengthy application, and there were certain criteria that you would need to meet, and unfortunately this wasn't successful. So I just wanted to raise these few issues here just to say that there are sort of particular barriers to conducting research on sexual violence in terms of accessing individuals within the criminal justice system. And so finally, I'll just discuss a few considerations that I had in terms of interviewing survivors for this project. So I think one key thing really is to consider the language that we use. So there's certainly sort of debate around whether the term victim or the term survivor is the most appropriate, or victim/survivor, or when a certain term might be more appropriate than the other. So this was something that I had to consider, particularly when I was advertising the study and producing posters and information sheets to recruit individuals. I also had one participant who, so I'd been using the word survivor throughout the interview, and she said, well, actually, I really don't identify with that term, and I really find the term victim to be more appropriate for me. And we discussed the fact that that was, a very personal thing. And from that interview, it made me consider sort of asking people which term they might prefer. So I think in any aspect of this research, whether it's in conducting the research and talking to individuals, or it's writing things up, it's really important to consider the language that we might use. In conducting these interviews as well, another consideration was to just be really flexible with my timetable, and flexible in terms of when interviews were scheduled, and knowing that they perhaps might be cancelled more often than interviews with other groups. So, for example, I had one participant who I spoke to on the day of the interview, so we'd agreed for a certain date, and I'd followed up with her to see if she was still available. And she'd said that unfortunately on that day she just wasn't in the right state of mind to take part. And I think that's important to recognise, as even though somebody might initially agree to take part and want to discuss their experiences with you, they may later sort of change their mind or find that difficult to do. So just as we've identified that researching in this area, you might not necessarily expect to be affected by an interview or by researching this, individuals also may feel that they're ready for an interview and then change their mind closest to the time. So I think it's just important to have that in mind. Obviously give the participants choice to do that, make them feel comfortable to sort of change the date, and also just be aware of that in terms of the time that it might take you for your data collection. And so another issue to consider is the type of questions that you might ask, that you might be asking throughout your interviews. So this is particularly important in relation to people whose cases are ongoing in the criminal justice system. So as I said, for me, this wasn't necessarily an issue, as people that I'd spoken to had already gone through the whole system and had had their outcome at the end. But certainly if you are speaking to people that are still going through that process, it's important to know the limits on what you're able to discuss. So just in the same way as it was important for me to be aware of what I could discuss with jurors and make sure that they were aware of that, that would be equally as important in talking to victims or survivors. And finally, in relation to participants' wellbeing as well as our own, I think it's very important with this group to offer a debrief and to really follow up with people afterwards, just to check that they're doing okay after the interview, and to provide them with details of support services that they may wish to contact. And as I say, this seemed particularly important to me with the one participant that I had that perhaps didn't expect to be affected by taking part. So you may find that people are kind of, yeah, as I say, don't expect to have that reaction. So it's important to follow up afterwards just to check that everything is okay with them. But yeah, that is everything from me, and just some considerations from my experience of doing a PhD. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Thank you.